part 3 of a series of videos called The History of the Stock Market. In my previous video, part 2, I covered the 2 decades from 1920 to 1940, talking about the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. In this video, I'm going to focus on the next 2 decades from 1940 to 1960, which were actually 2 of the highest growth decades in the history of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Before I get started, I just want to mention that I've pulled these charts and all my other charts from stockcharts.com. I'm not getting paid by this company, but I think they have some great resources on there, and I highly recommend you check them out. Anyhow, at the beginning of the 1940s, we had an immediate dip in the markets, as you can see here. This was largely due to war concerns. We were right in the middle of World War II, and Nazi Germany was gaining increased control and increased power around the globe. This was quite disconcerting for the markets, because if you have a dictatorial regime running the economy, that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for free enterprise. And a lot of people were very concerned, especially as you can see in the bottom here around 1941, 1942. A lot of people were concerned that free enterprise would not be allowed to exist anymore. And people said, we need to go straight to cash. We need to sell our securities. However, the war did have another byproduct, and this byproduct was that it galvanized employment. All of a sudden, there were a whole lot of jobs for the United States once they got involved. People were able to manufacture equipment and manufacture food, and there was all this increased demand that came pretty much out of nowhere. And this increased demand led to a jump up in the stock market. As the United States got more and more involved in the war, the stock market had a resurgence from 1942, jumping up to 43, and kind of peaking kind of right after the war ended, actually, around 1946, because people said, hey, the war's done, and now we also, we've kind of gotten ourselves out of this long economic slump that the Great Depression had put us in. However, what they did not realize, at least at first, was that a lot of the growth was artificial. After all, it was created from war, and the end of World War II meant that a lot of this demand for goods and services no longer existed. We didn't need to ship a whole lot of goods overseas. So unemployment started going up, and the stock market remained relatively stagnant through the end of the 1940s. Starting in the 1950s, we had one of the single best decades. As you can see here, there's huge growth in just a 10-year period. And there were a couple of things that drove this. Probably the single most important thing, though, was that for the first time in maybe 25 years or so, we had a normal economy. We weren't in a major war like World War I or World War II, and we weren't in an onset of a Great Depression or a huge speculative boom like the Roaring Twenties. So it sounds relatively normal, but what was surprising is that this hadn't happened. This normalcy hadn't really occurred in quite a long time. And people said this is a great time to build businesses and grow these businesses. And as a result, we had quite a long run of economic and investment growth. There were a couple of small glitches along the way. One of them was the recession of 1953, and this was driven by the Korean War and some of the issues associated with that that led to a temporary economic slowdown. But as you can see, the stock market very quickly recovered. 1954 and 55, it bounced back up. Around 1957, we had a second recession. And again, this was a short-lived recession that was largely driven by monetary policy, the Federal Reserve setting interest rates and kind of slowing the economy down a little bit. But as you can see, it was short, and we had another resurgence straight out of it. And at the end of the decade, we actually peaked at a new high of 679.36. So as you can see, the growth from 1940, where the Dow was around 140 back here, it jumped all the way up to 679. So that's a significant multiple. That's close to a 500% multiple over the course of 20 years. So this was a tremendous 20-year period for the U.S. economy. So in my next video, I'll be talking about the years 1960 to 1980 and how some of the events in those years affected the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Thank you very much for watching, and for similar videos in this series and other series, I highly recommend you check out my website, www.kanjo.com.